So, William Ramsay, he was a Scottish archaeologist in the late 19th century, early 20th century, and he was also a critic of the Bible. He didn't really
Mm.
trust that the Bible was authentic, didn't believe many of the archaeological, historical aspects of it, and in particular, he doubted the authenticity of the Gospel of Luke.
Mm-hmm.
And so he kind of just went on his way with these beliefs for a while. Then he decided to try to disprove it once and for all, right? Using what he knew best, archaeology. So he went on this decades long archaeological expedition across many biblical places like Asia Minor to try to disprove the books, to try to find little inaccuracies or things that would conflict with the biblical account of the
What
history,
happened? Yeah.
right? But as he did this, he noticed that over time, Luke's descriptions matched real, like geographical, political, and cultural details with a lot of accuracy, including city names, travel routes, and even minor rulers or leadership structures of the time.
Mm-hmm.
And after this search that turned out, the opposite of what he expected, he later reversed his position, saying that Luke is a historian of the first rank. Not merely are his statements of fact trustworthy, this author should be placed along with the very greatest of historians.
Mm-hmm.
And he later went on to become one of the greatest defenders of the New Testament's historical validity. And this shows a lot like the Lee Strobel story, where you go to try to disprove the Bible and you come back with more faith in it. It shows that exterior evidence, beyond just the Bible itself, can help to support the New Testament and its meaning even now.
Welcome to the Faith Isn't Blind podcast. We're your hosts,
Leif Brahmi.
and Micah Rose, and we like to explore the core of Christianity in a philosophically and evidentially rigorous way
Yes.
that hopefully can be approachable to young people.
Yes.
We hope. Probably not. Oh well. So yeah, it's interesting that you bring up that guy, because I was actually thinking about another guy who kind of did a similar thing. His name was J. Warner Wallace, and he wrote the book Cold Case Christianity, and he's more modern than your guy.
Yeah.
And he went and he tried to he was a homicide detective, and he reviewed the evidence in a way that he would, as in court or something, just regarding this as possible eyewitness testimony, or seeing how well cohered with details he knew. And he also came to the conclusion that these were very, very historically reliable documents.
Yeah.
And the Bible, or I should say the New Testament in specific, is very interesting as far as like historical documents, because there's more historical documents in the New Testament than like anything else. Like, and when I say documents, I mean like manuscripts. So they're like little fragments that we have. And you said that it like coheres well with details. So one of the details that I heard very recently, and it was kind of interesting, is that Luke, in his book, gives Pilate the title like governor, but another historian, one of the better historians, like of the antiquity, gives Pilate another title. And so for a while, people thought Luke was wrong, because they were like, well, this other historian said that Pilate was this, like a procurator or something. Right. But they had an archaeological find where they found something called the Pilate Stone. And on the Pilate Stone, it gives Pilate the title that Luke called him, not the other historian called him. So this other guy got it wrong and Luke got it right, which is very interesting. Something that you could really only know if you were there.
Time,
Mm-hmm. So yeah, historical reliability, archaeology. The manuscripts. I mentioned the manuscripts earlier. So we didn't have very many like manuscripts. There were like 3 manuscripts that we had to work with, for the large portion of Christian history. But in I think the early 1900s, there were 2 archaeologists that found this place called Oxyrhynchus, which was it's a place in Egypt, and it's like a trash dump. It was a trash dump. Very good for archaeology trash dumps. You would have no idea. Yeah. And it was near a place where they would make papyrus. So there was a lot of like discarded papyri. And there were so many fragments of like the New Testament manuscripts, particularly like the Gospels. And because we had so many, we were able to like sort of recreate. Yeah, compare, yeah. And that's textual criticism.
Right.
So textual criticism, if you don't know what that is when you take a bunch of different manuscripts and you just sort of compare them, because there's going to be differences, right? There's going to be little discrepancies. And but when you look at like 40 different documents of the same piece of writing, you know, one of them will have like 39 of them will have the same sentence and one of them will have a different sentence. And so then you can figure out, well, the one that has a different sentence from the other 39 is probably the wrong one in this regard.
Right.
So the more documents you have, the closer you can get to reconstructing the original document.
Right.
So even though we don't have the original copies of Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, any of like the epistles or Revelation or anything like that, we're actually pretty confident that we're very, very close to what the authors originally wrote.
How do we know? I mean, if we are close to what the authors originally wrote, I've heard that some of the gospel authors wrote their books many, many years after the actual event. So how do we know that that's accurate?
So the dating of the Gospels is a debated topic. So most historians would place the three synoptic Gospels, that's Matthew, Mark, and Luke, somewhere after like 70 AD, around there. So about 30 something years after the events of Jesus. Even if that is the case, that's not like too bad as far as historical documents go, especially documents of antiquity. But there is, and the reason for that is like the earliest time you get citations of this. Like if you get a citation of Luke, like you have like, I don't know, this is just a hypothetical situation. I'm not really saying this is what happened. Like you got a fragment of Luke and you date this fragment to be from like 120 AD, but you find it in Spain. And it's like, how did it get there? You know, you need some time for the original to be copied and moved to Spain. So you know that it was written a fair time before that. So something like that. The other thing is the people and places it mentions. So if you have like the Pilate thing, like Luke knowing what Pilate's true title was, true title was, that's not something that like if you were just guessing, you would be able to figure that out. If you're writing super late, you probably wouldn't know that detail. Or just knowledge of Jerusalem before it was destroyed. So in AD 70, Jerusalem was like just razed. It was destroyed completely by the Romans. But the writers of the gospel seem to know the layout very well. So there would be like hints of like going down or going up that match with the actual elevation or like things like that. And that just makes it likely that it was written fairly early.
Right. Are there other historical documents that we take as true that were written far beyond the actual events?
So so like things about like Julius Caesar, we've got like I think 3 autobiographies of Julius Caesar. And the first one is written more than a century after his death, I'm pretty sure. I could be wrong about that. Maybe it's Alexander the Great I'm thinking of.
So it's a bit of a double standard that people criticize the Gospels for the time they were written if we take those as true.
Well, yeah, if you take it as just historical documents, then a lot of times I think there is a double standard for like what level of evidence you're requiring. But the reason that I think that this double standard is often given is because people are like, well, there's a lot, more important things that happen in this book.
That's true.
If I want to trust this book, I want a higher standard of historical reliability.
Yeah.
But I do think that the Bible still meets that standard of high levels of historical reliability. I mean, as J. Warner Wallace, it concluded, and that other guy, the Scottish guy, Ramsay.
Gordon Ramsay.
I don't think that's his name. But yeah.
So you talked about the Gospels and how there were other copies of the Gospels and things that we could compare them to make sure that they were reliable.
Mm-hmm.
But for other parts of the Bible, like the Old Testament, what do we have that we can verify them with?
So the Old Testament was written over a much larger period of time.
Mm-hmm.
So the New Testament is written in 30, 50 years.
Right.
And like the whole New Testament is written in that time span. It's a very small time span. Well, probably longer than 50. I don't know, about around 50 years. The Old Testament is written over like hundreds of years with a bunch of different authors. So as far as that, our biggest documents that we have are the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament. That was around 200 or 300 BC.
Mm-hmm.
And we have the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are these preserved copies of a bunch of Old Testament books. We don't really know who wrote them, but we have them. And they're also from super old. But we have a bunch of Jewish and rabbinic writings that have been preserved that quote the Old Testament or Old Testament books from a long time ago. So we know that these books existed at some point. And we can date them. There's also some debate about dating Old Testament books. Especially people want to date Revelation prophetic books like
And
Daniel. They want to date that later because
if you did
it pretty-
before the prophecies would be pretty good evidence.
There's a story actually about the book of Daniel that it predicts Alexander the Great.
Mm-hmm.
So very much Christian interpretation of Daniel will have a prediction of Alexander the Great coming and conquering a bunch of places. And there's a story in tradition that when Alexander the Great came to Jerusalem, the rabbis went out and showed him the prophecy of him coming.
Wow.
And the stuff. And then he got scared and he didn't conquer it. And he left it alone. He left Judea alone. So that's interesting. I'm not sure if that happened. That's hearsay because I don't really know if that happened. But it's a cool story if it did happen. A similar thing happens with the Gospels actually, because Jesus predicts the fall of Jerusalem, and that's a kind of an obvious prediction. There's not a lot of ways you can get around that with interpreting.
Yeah.
So that's why a lot of Gospels are placed after the fact of the fall of Jerusalem that happened in 70 AD.
Yeah.
Because you can't have a prophecy.
So we talked a bit about the archaeological evidence in the first story, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there is archaeological evidence for many parts of the Bible, but the main archaeological criticism people have is about the Exodus. And the Exodus is a big, significant event in the Old Testament, right?
Mm-hmm.
Israel captivity for many years in Egypt, and then this huge exodus away from Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
But there's not really a lot of archaeological evidence to point to for that in Egyptian history, or just as far as evidence for the Exodus, the Israelites leaving in the first place. So what would you say about the lack of evidence there?
Well, I don't know too much about the Exodus story actually, so I'm not going to give you a satisfactory answer here because I haven't researched this at all. But what I will say is that very often in the ancient Near East, cultures don't record their losses. So if you something goes bad for you, you won't write that down. They'll only write down their victories. If you read the steely tablets of their history, it'll just be win after win after win after win, and the empires don't exist anymore, so clearly they didn't win all the time.
Right.
Or there'll be other people who record wins against them, and then you know that okay, well you lost that battle, you just didn't record it.
Yeah.
So very often, perhaps the Egyptians just wouldn't want to record that.
Yeah.
It's
possible.
Yeah. That's all I can say about that. I don't actually know too much about the Exodus.
Right.
Archaeology.
And the last thing that I have thought of is kind of a silly question.
Mm-hmm.
But even if we know that all of this stuff was written accurately, as in it wasn't falsified later on, and people actually wrote these things, how do we know that they aren't just lying?
So,
Making stuff up?
yeah. So, well, the Gospels, some of them claim to be historical accounts. So Luke especially claims to be a historical account. In the opening lines of his book, he says something akin to like I want to make like an account of the events, which is like the direct way that like the other historians of the time say, like, if you want to make an account of the events, a good history, this is how you do it. And he sort of follows their formula. So Luke is very much trying to be just this historical book.
Yeah.
But as far as like is there theological coloring? Is there like late legendary development and stuff like that? There's a couple reasons to think that that's unlikely. So the first is that a lot of Christian beliefs, you're sort of at a loss of how to explain them, because a lot of them don't come from pagan influences and don't come from Jewish influences. So, it's how do you get these beliefs?
Yeah.
And as to like a legend, could all of these things just be like a legend that developed and then people wrote back into it? The problem is that we know that the Gospels were written, fairly early. Even you can, if you testify them as late as you possibly can, you're still probably not getting Mark, which is the earliest gospel, written any earlier or any later than like 80 AD. But legends can't really form in the generation where the people who were like around at the same time as the legend took place are still alive. So legends don't form in one generation. You need at least a generation to like forget what actually happened. You need everybody to be dead before you can start lying about that period of history. And also, if you read things like Mark, there's not a lot of legendary development. Like, it's kind of bare bones.
Yeah.
And Luke is also a little bit bare bones. Whereas, like in the later, especially in something like the resurrection, Mark, Matthew, and Luke just very bare bones. It's like not like crazy. Whereas if you read things like John, there's dead people walking around the street. Or if you read like an apocryphal gospel, like I don't remember if it's Thomas or Peter, but there's this whole epic that happens when Jesus is raised, like God speaking, like a giant face in the sky, and he's like talking to Israel and stuff like that. So that's sort of what a late legendary development looks like.
Yeah.
Not just the account.
Yeah.
The other thing is that there's not really a significant motive for them to lie. They didn't like make that much money or live like better lives because of their lies, and they stuck with it. I mean,
most of them were martyred.
Yeah, a lot of them were martyred, and they didn't live like nice lives because of the lies that they told. But also, and this is interesting. There's historical methods that we use to analyze these sorts of documents. This is the biggest one. The other ones are kind of like peripheral. This is the biggest one. There's a bunch of historical methods we use to determine if people are telling the truth in their narratives, to just get out the truth of what the actual history is. Some of them is like independent attestation, multiple independent attestation. So if you have two people that say the same thing that didn't talk to each other, then it's very unlikely that they would invent the same false story. They would invent different stories if they were inventing a story. If they say the same thing, they're probably telling the truth, or at least similar things.
Right.
There's also things like undesigned coincidences. So this is where some detail in one gospel can only be explained by a detail in another gospel. So like on the Sermon on the Mount, I think, or maybe it's when Jesus feeds the 5,000. One account mentions that the grass is like green. But it doesn't mention that it's like spring. The other account mentions that it's spring, but doesn't mention that the grass is green. So those are like, the accounts cohere very well.
Yeah.
But there's no like reason narratively to put those details in. If you're going to, you would put both of them. You would put this, it was spring, so the grass is green.
Right.
If you were inventing it. But if you were just remembering something about the event, you would just write that. And they happen to cohere. So there's stuff like that. So there's a lot of things like that. And we can, if you want to read, there's lots of literature on this. You don't have to listen to us.
Yeah.
I shouldn't say that though. But there's better information than what we're saying.
Yeah.
But you can read stuff like that for the reasons why a lot of the accounts are historically reliable.
So a lot of people try to criticize the Bible based on what we've been talking about. So textual criticisms, archaeological and historical criticisms. But one of the main ones that people do talk about is kind of a form of textual criticism, contradictions within the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
So there'd be a part of the Bible that seemingly conflicts with another part of the Bible. And people use this to kind of say, well, if the book isn't consistent within itself, then it can't possibly be true.
Mm-hmm.
And this becomes more of an issue if you view the Bible as specifically dictated, every word specifically dictated by God. Because then, yeah, you do have contradictions between God's dictation, then that puts into question everything in the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
But the Adventist take on inspiration in this way is that the Bible is God breathed and not specifically God written or God dictated. And Ellen White has a quote, the point we make here is simply that the treasure of God's good news is conveyed to mankind in earthen vessels. The packaging contains mistakes, errors, discrepancies, call them what you will, that in no way did it deny the divine inspiration of the material nor the divine authority behind the messages. So another way to think of it is that the Bible is perfect for its intended purpose. Like the core of the message is true and accurate regardless of what the author's packaging is.
Mm-hmm.
But they all have different packaging. Like, for instance, Amos. I think Amos was a shepherd or something, and he had a very rustic way of presenting his message, whereas Luke had a more like formal, rigorous.
He was
way
like a
of
historian,
presenting
yeah.
his message, right?
Well, okay. So to that, I think there's two questions as far as answering like contradictions and like seeming errors and stuff like that. There's the historical question, which is, do these contradictions make the documents less historically reliable? And I think that no. Even if they are like blatant contradictions in some areas, when you have a contradiction, very often, or at least when you have most contradictions, I don't know. But when you have a contradiction, it doesn't really affect anything that's super important in the narrative. Right. Even if the authors are just wrong, it's not crazy.
Like you're not going to have a contradiction where
No,
the gospel says Jesus didn't write it.
Yeah, no major. There's no major point of doctrine is really contested by like one of the contradictions. So I think it's still historically reliable even if you have contradictions, and contradictions are to be expected in eyewitness testimony.
Especially even if it's one book that has contradictions, but the Bible is an anthology of books.
Yeah. So like if you've got any eyewitnesses, there's going to be like discrepancies and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So like a big example is when the Declaration of Independence was like announced, like somebody came out onto the balcony. Some of the early accounts put one guy as the one who read the message, and the other early accounts put this other guy as the one who gave the message. And this interestingly leads into my next point is that this seems like a contradiction, but what had actually happened is that the first guy went out, but he didn't have a loud speaking voice. So then another guy came out and read it in his better voice. Yeah. But if you had said that before, it like not knowing that was the case, you kind of look like you were coping, trying to, grasping at straws, trying to make the accounts fit together. But the things like that do happen. Yeah. Eyewitnesses will record and focus on different things. Yeah. The second question, I think, is the question of theological contradictions. Like you mentioned, like how can there be contradictions if this is like a God-inspired text, And I think that is a different question. So I think that I can sort of be like, whatever, contradictions. The account is still historically reliable. I can still get to the truth of Christianity. Once I get to the truth of Christianity, all of a sudden, it feels like God wouldn't want to allow these sorts of things, that he would at least try to avoid having like blatant contradictions. And I take a different line than you would, I think, and I think that Ellen White would. I don't know if I can say that. In the way I think that, or I suppose like the level at which God inspires the Bible. And I think that a lot of the times, most of the time, probably all of the time, I'm not sure though, that there is a contradiction. It's only an apparent contradiction.
Yeah.
And upon further investigation, it kind of falls away. And one of the reasons that I want to hold to this higher level of inspiration is because sometimes when I see people hold to a lower level of inspiration, they'll just sort of let the contradictions be. They won't investigate them. Well, like, oh, it's God breathed, not God said. We don't really need to worry about the contradictions. But when you like let them just sort of sit there and just be like, whatever, it kind of like hurts a skeptic who's looking in, because they'll be like, oh, well, that contradiction is still there and you're not giving an explanation for it. That can be unsatisfying. So I think that even if it's not true, which I think it is, a higher view of inspiration is good for inspiring you to defend the Bible.
Yeah.
And I think you've got some contradictions you wanted to bring up.
Yeah, and I do see your point about how, from a skeptic's perspective, even though the God-breathed view of inspiration, kind of leaving the contradictions be, that could be discouraging for a skeptic. In a way, it could also kind of be a form of adding validity to the scripture in a way, because if it was a fabrication, like for instance, take the Gospels having the slight contradictions in who visited the grave. I think, Matthew has Mary Magdalene and the other Mary. She just says the other Mary. And then Mark has Mary Magdalene, Mary mother of James, and Salome. And then Luke has Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary mother of James, and the others. And then in John, it's just Mary. So if everything was being constructed as this big conspiracy, this big fake out, then you wouldn't really be seeing these contradictions, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in a way, you could interpret it as adding a little bit of human validity to these stories, and the fact that it wasn't constructed to deceive people.
So it's interesting that you bring that up, because I think that I can actually have my cake both ways for that particular example. I can have my human flair, and also it's not a contradiction. So they record different people coming to the tomb, but they don't contradict. They don't say that this was the only amount of people that came to the tomb.
They leave the door open for.
Yeah. So if I only mention, like, say me and my friends, like 5 of my friends go to the store, I can say me and League went to the store, and it's still true. Or I can say like me, Jaden, and Leif went to the store, and it's still true even if I don't mention that like League was also there going to the store with me. But different authors will focus on different people, especially depending on their narrative or what they're trying to get at, and they can still be true.
Yeah. So you could take that perspective of just not the listing all the people, just listing a few, and you could also take the perspective that think of like a car crash kind of. Imagine there's a lot of witnesses to a car crash. The red car hits the white car, and that's the base of the story.
Mm-hmm.
But some people see the red car driver get out and help the white car driver. Some people see bystanders help the white car driver. Some people see one bystander and the person in the red car help the white car driver. And same core, but different details, because everyone has a slightly different perspective.
Yeah, it's very, very important to remember, because this happens a lot when people bring up supposed contradictions, is that omission is not contradiction.
Yeah.
So if you just fail to include a detail, that doesn't mean you include not the detail.
Right.
You don't say that this didn't happen. You just didn't see it.
Yeah.
And you're not wrong for just not including that detail. So like sometimes people will say, like in the birth account of Jesus in Matthew and Luke, in one of them he goes to Egypt, and in the other one there's no mention of them going to Egypt.
One of them has the wise men, and one of them has the shepherds as well.
Yeah, and it's like just because they included different details doesn't mean that they didn't both happen.
Right.
Or omission is not contradiction.
And I do like what you said about how different authors focus on different things based on the point they're trying to make.
Mm-hmm.
Because Jesus' last words is a good example of this. In Matthew and Mark, the last words are, my God, why have you forsaken me? And then in Luke, it's, into your hands I commit my spirit. And then John, it's, it is finished.
It is finished, yeah.
So these are all seemingly completely different last words of Jesus. But talking about the omission isn't contradiction. He could have said all of these at some point, right?
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't mean that these are the only words he said near the end of his life. But maybe each gospel records the words that most correspond to the points they're trying to make in their books. Right?
And interestingly, it doesn't say that these are like the last words of Jesus. This is just the last words that are recorded in that gospel.
Right, in the books.
So it doesn't like, you know,
Really contradict.
it doesn't really contradict there.
And Matthew and Mark, kind of a big theme in their books was about the suffering of Christ.
Mm-hmm.
And so it would make sense that they would focus on this really like painstaking, my God, why have you forsaken me? And then Luke, of course, is more about trust. John is emphasizing fulfillment a bit more. It is finished.
Mm-hmm.
So
it's more theologically.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Jesus lived a long life. We don't have every recorded part of his ministry. We don't have every recorded conversation.
I mean,
So it
John
makes
even
sense.
John writes that.
Yeah.
Remember, he has that little disclaimer at the end of his gospel, like
Jesus
you
did
couldn't
not-
write everything down,
People focus on the things that resonated most with them. And we see it now and we see
Yeah.
it then.
and the important things for the purpose they're writing.
Yeah.
Writing is about your audience and your purpose.
audience
Gotta
and
remember that
purpose.
from English 101. Yeah.
And beyond the Gospels, there's also examples in like small details in the Old Testament that seem less about people's perspectives and more just kind of clerical errors at first glance.
Mm-hmm.
So, for instance, this isn't the Old Testament, but a different number of demon-possessed men between Matthew and Mark and Luke. And one, this story mentions there's one and the other is two. Once again, neither text claims exclusivity, like there's only one or there's only two. Maybe Mark and Luke were just focusing on like the most prominent
Mm-hmm.
person
Yeah.
in the story,
Or whatever.
right? And there was another one. And then the second one, example in this category, is the number of troops. So in Chronicles and in Samuel, there's both a section that records the amount of troops in Israel and Judah. I think one mentions 80,000 troops and one is like 100,000. And these could really occur for several reasons. One is rounding. Maybe they rounded in one book or the other, including or excluding certain types of troops, like foot troops versus cavalry, stuff like that. Different texts just treat it differently. Or honestly, once again, if you take the view that it's God breathed, not God dictated, you could just, this isn't an important detail in the story really.
Mm-hmm.
You could just say that, yeah, humans wrote this book, humans make mistakes, it's a clerical error. That doesn't take away from the truth of the historical text.
Okay. Yeah, so when you have like differences in numbers there, you kind of have to remember that precise timekeeping and like troop counting wasn't really a thing that people did. People would just sort of guess. You know, they just sort of look at a group of people and be like, it's like 2,000. It's like 2,000 people in there, you know? So the words about can save the truthfulness of a lot of text.
Like, I don't think there was someone counting all the heads in the feeding of the 5,000.
So yeah, imprecision isn't necessarily untruthfulness. So like if I can say like you know, we're about 20 miles from my house. Or I could say we're 19.6 miles from my house. Those are like both true statements. One is more precise than the other. And you know, you could presumably get more precise than that even. But they're both true statements.
Yeah.
So that happens a lot of the times. You know, you can't ask for exact precision in timekeeping or in numbers all the time. Especially in times when there weren't any clocks. You know, you only had sundials.
A lot less advanced.
Yeah.
So more difficult.
Mm-hmm.
There's also a few contradictions in the Bible that kind of have to do with theological tension, seeming theological tension. There's not as many of these. Most of the contradictions are basically just nitpicking, like details.
Mm-hmm.
But one is in Proverbs 26, 4-5. It's kind of a famous one. It says, "Do not answer a fool according to his folly, or you will be like him." And then shortly after it says, "Answer a fool according to his folly, or he will be wise in his own ways, in his own eyes." And this one is pretty obviously, I think, intentional. Just saying that you need situational wisdom. Sometimes it's best to
Respond. Sometimes it's best to
sometimes
just
it's
not
best to
respond.
ignore, right?
Yeah.
So that's a famous one that I don't think is as serious as people make it out to be.
Yeah, I don't think that like you don't even need that much like intelligence.
To
You know,
realize
even if you don't
it's-
believe that Solomon was like the wisest man ever, to like write a contradict yourself like 2 sentences later. Like people don't.
You're not that stupid.
You would have to if you know like you'd have to never proofread that book
Yeah.
for that to get by.
Yeah, and also hold two completely different views of this.
Yeah, yeah. At the same time, which doesn't feel like likely.
And another contradiction is Judas's death. Matthew says that he
Oh,
was
yeah, this is
hanged,
an interesting one.
and Acts says that he fell headlong, burst open, and his intestines spilled out.
So, yeah, very interesting about this one. When people fall down, their intestines don't burst out.
No.
Unless
They've
they
been
happen,
sitting out in the sun
they've been
for a
sitting
while.
they've been hanging from a rope out in the sun for quite a while. So I actually think that these this is an undesigned coincidence in my opinion. This isn't a contradiction.
Yeah.
That
Could have been hanged and then like the branch or the rope broke.
I think that's probably what happened because again, when people fall, they don't explode.
Yeah.
But it says that
Unless
Judas.
you're Judas, I guess.
Well, maybe Judas was just special.
Yeah. Maybe he had a very weak.
Maybe it really
skin
is.
layer.
Maybe it really is a contradiction, and the Jewish just was very unique. Yeah.
So another one, of course, is the genealogy of Jesus. So Matthew
Mhm.
traces Jesus' line through Solomon down to Joseph, and then Luke just has different names in his genealogy. It's just a different genealogy.
Yeah.
And it's possible, there's a few explanations for this that I've seen.
There's a lot of explanations
Yeah.
for this one.
One is that Luke uses Mary's family lineage and then just names Joseph as the father of Christ, but that the lineage that he lists is Mary's line instead of Joseph's line.
Mm-hmm.
Another one is that he uses like a legal historical lineage rather than a biological lineage, because there's many different ways to record genealogies. It's not like every genealogy in the Bible is the exact same process of like how it's recorded. And then it's also possible that one of them uses a more exact every name lineage, and then one focuses on more major historical characters to emphasize like a theological point about who Jesus is and who he came from.
Yeah, so they're especially in Matthew's, the way he does it. Matthew organizes his genealogy as 14 generations, 14 generations, 14 generations. And he does that to be like symbolic because like numbers are like super important, you know, it's like especially like 7 times 2, 7 is very big. But 14 generations from Abraham to David, and yeah, so like just 3 sets of 14. And to do that, he omits people from his genealogy. So if you look at like the genealogy of like the line of David and stuff like that, it'll be like the same people, but like there'll be omissions from what's in Matthew. And I think he does that to just maintain his structure.
Yeah.
And in other
This guy anymore.
yeah, and yeah, I don't care about this guy. Let's get him out of the genealogy, even though you know he was there. But you know, you just say like Jehoshaphat begat, and then
His
they'll skip this guy, and then yeah, yeah, and that's not too uncommon in Jewish texts either. Sometimes they'll like abbreviate genealogies like that. Yeah.
So a lot of the contradictions that we've talked about either explained by, you know, they're not really contradictions. They're affirmed by details that are affirmed by other books, or it's just based on different witnesses focusing on different things.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the main contradictions isn't necessarily text versus text. It's Old Testament versus New Testament. And this is also something that people talk about a lot when they criticize, not only criticizing the Bible, but criticizing the Christian conception of God, which is a big deal. And it's the perceived difference between how God interacts with humans in the Old Testament and how God interacts with humans in the New Testament, which is interesting. So there's a lot of different stories about God's, quote, cruelty in the Old Testament, but one of the most famous ones is the story of Abraham and Isaac. And, of course, it's a story where God asks Abraham to bring his son Isaac and sacrifice him to God. And this seems completely contrary to how God would act in the New Testament, or how he should act. And, of course, he doesn't actually make him sacrifice his son, but still the idea that God would say that seems inconsistent. But one of the main explanations that I've heard for this is that it's part of differentiating Yahweh from the other pagan gods in the area. Because based on our cultural context, if we were told to sacrifice our kids,
that's crazy.
that's crazy.
You know?
And it was still kind of crazy then, but not as crazy because
Like a lot of them did that. Yeah.
Child sacrifice was a part of many of the religions back then, and it was kind of, you know, par for the course as far as the cultures went. So the fact that God asked him to do this, common practice as far as worshiping goes back then, And then he offers up an alternative. He says, you don't have to do this anymore. Here's a sacrifice that I gave you. One, it shows that he's different. It sets him apart. It sets up the standard for what comes after throughout the whole rest of the Bible. And it kind of points forward to God giving his own son a sacrifice of his own instead of a human sacrifice.
Yeah. So I think there's a lot to say about this. I mean, I would recommend the book, Is God a Moral Monster by Paul Copan. And this could be a whole episode in itself, talking about like the cruelties of the Old Testament God, so to speak. But I mean, important thing to remember, because I don't know how much time we're going to spend on this, is that we do have some temporal snobbery, in that we're like, our perspective of like what's right and wrong obviously is influenced by the time we live in. And we live in kind of a much, much nicer time
Yes.
for, people doing wrong things. So there's not as much child sacrifice or cannibalism or just general violent evils that were a lot more prevalent in the ancient Near East. The ancient Near East was a very messy and violent culture.
Yeah.
Murder and stuff like that, very much more prevalent. So it's easy to look down and be like, wow, God had to take such extreme measures back then. He's, so evil.
Kind of
But
an
like,
extreme time.
yeah, it was a very extreme time.
And yeah, so you talked about it's a barbaric society in a way. So, God always meets us where we are. It's kind of where they were. And
Mhm.
another point is kind of in the story of Christianity, the story of salvation. It kind of shows how things were before Jesus' sacrifice from our perspective. It shows the consequences of what sin does to us before we accept Jesus' sacrifice.
Mhm.
And it shows judgment, the consequences of sin. So even from our perspective, I think the Old Testament is an interesting way to like think about the consequences of sin. Really.
Yeah. I mean, you read any history book and it'll show you the consequences of sin. History isn't pretty most of the time.
And another thing to consider is that even though God seemed more barbaric in the Old Testament than in the New Testament, there were many intentional things that I think he did that were countercultural even then, that kind of preceded his message in the New Testament. So we talked about Abraham and Isaac kind of going against the child sacrifice worship culture of the time. Also, it is good at the end of the creation story. Like a lot of other cultures around that time had creation stories, but of course a lot of them were polytheistic. A lot of the elements of the creation story had to do with warring gods and the earth being some result of chaos in heaven. But the Christian creation story, the Hebrew creation story, was very ordered and it was good. And that's
Mhm.
the emphasis of the entire story. And once again, it's similar to the other cultures, but it's different enough that it makes a contrast.
Yeah, another big difference is that the man and woman were made in the image of God.
Yeah.
So in other creation stories, the kings and queens would be made, the royalty would be made in the image of God, but the average person wasn't. The average person was just, it's accident
Yeah.
creation sort of, very often.
And another one was eye for eye, tooth for tooth. And that's another one from our perspective, looking back, we're like, that's crazy. I don't want to lose my eye.
Mhm.
But back then, revenge in the justice system wasn't proportional. Like it wasn't based on what is the proper retaliation for this act. It escalated, right? So if someone stole your kid, kidnapped your kid, you wouldn't kidnap their kid, or you wouldn't like get your kid back. You'd go and burn their village, right?
Mm-hmm.
So eye for eye, tooth for tooth is kind of toning down on that and saying, obviously that's not the ideal, because later on Jesus in the New Testament says like turn your other cheek, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's another level. But this is just toning down the cultural background of it.
The other thing is that there were different punishments for different classes of society. So if you were rich and you committed a crime, you would just get like a less punishment than if you were poor and you committed the same crime.
Yeah.
So good that doesn't happen anymore.
Yeah, definitely.
How lucky we are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then the last two contrasts that I pointed out were cities of refuge to escape revenge killings, kind of, for people who are fleeing their country, immigrants, and yeah, people who are had political issues. That was something that was contrary to the idea of that time that he established. And then also regulating slavery and polygamy. This is another one from our time looking back. Like, what are you talking about? You could still have slaves. What are you talking about? You could have multiple wives. But there were a lot of regulations that were put in place in the Old Testament that gave slaves and other wives more, I wouldn't say autonomy, but you know what I'm saying. It was
Yeah.
definitely a higher level of respect than they had had.
But yeah, you have a lot of this stuff in the Old Testament where it's a case law, where God doesn't approve of what's happening or like approve of a situation, but he gives laws for what to do in this situation. So like for example, some people would be, you know, too poor to live and they felt that they had to sell their children into slavery. And God gives like commandments like, well, if you have to do this, then if you're buying, you know, a slave, you shouldn't take it for less than this amount. Like this is how much it should go for, so that the family doesn't get like scammed or whatever, so that the family can actually support themselves. And they give laws for how to treat the slaves in slavery, and then inevitably to release them, the year of jubilee and stuff like that, or after a certain number of years, and to give them money when you release them. And that's a like very very big difference from the other Near Eastern cultures of the time. So if you want to, you know, if you don't view God as like merciful for how he handles these sorts of situations, you can look and see how the other new oh oh my gosh, ancient Near Eastern cultures and their laws would handle slaves.
Right.
And you know, it's a lot
A
worse.
lot more wrathful.
It is a lot more wrathful. You know, cutting out tongues and cutting off arms and just killing at some points.
A lot of blood.
Yeah, very violent. But again, read Paul Copan's book. He explains it better than I do.
So we talked about Abraham and Isaac, wrath versus mercy in the Old Testament and New Testament. The last contrast that I think is kind of significant is the distant versus the personal God. In the Old Testament, God is pretty much unapproachable. The idea of a personal relationship isn't really talked about much. And in the New Testament, of course, he is personal. And I think this is pretty easy to explain, just thinking about once again, the story of Christianity. In Eden, God was personal. God was close to humans. He walked with us. And then sin separated us from God, and that's kind of the Old Testament. And then Jesus' life and sacrifice returned us partially to that Eden
Well,
ideal, kind of.
Yeah, the word atonement is the Old English word at one meant. It's to bring at
together.
one again. So yeah, I think that just makes sense theologically.
Right.
Jesus' sacrifice allowed us to be close to God again.
Right. So I think that the difference between the Old Testament and New Testament God is definitely overblown. A lot of his actions can be explained in the context of their culture a bit more. But I do think that it's important to note that there is a difference, because the way he interacts with us is different depending on where we are.
Yeah, of course. You know, even if he's the same, the person he's interacting with changes. So
And the culture he's interacting with.
well, yeah, the people he's interacting with changes. So the way he interacts changes. Just like how you would talk different to like your friends or your mom or something like that. It's not crazy. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about is the canon of scripture. So this is just what books should be in the Bible. What books should be in the Bible, Leif?
All of them. Lord
All of them?
Rings, the appendix.
The appendix?
Yep. 1984. Just put them all in.
Yep.
They need to get me on the Council of Nicaea.
Yeah, you should have got you picking the books. Yeah. So this is an interesting question. You know, we've got this Bible. It's got 66 books in it. Why those and not 66 other books?
Bell and the Dragons.
You know, well, you know, even other like religious books about Christianity, like the Gospel of Peter or the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Mary. These like you know, other texts that might have been around at the same time. You know, why aren't they in?
A bunch of people in robes.
Bunch of people in robes decided that's pretty close,
Yeah.
Slave.
It is pretty close.
So this is one of the arguments that Catholics and Eastern Orthodox people will use to sort of place church authority over scriptural authority. is this question of canon. How did we get the books? And they say that you sort of need a infallible church magisterium to pick the books of the Bible, to identify the books. And I don't think that's the case. So as far as the books, how they were actually picked, it was a process, and it took a while. And, we'd finally gotten all of the books picked out probably around like 200 AD, around that time. And the main process of this was just tying down each of these writings to its historic author. So, like, you had to tie down Mark to the actual Mark and to a real apostle. Most people think that Mark's source was Peter, or Luke you had to tie it down to the actual Luke that was in the early church. But it was a process, and it went on for a while, and eventually they did just sort of pick these books as special. Another way they did this was cross-referencing. So if Jesus validated some other book, or some
Reference the book in his.
reference the book, then you've got some reason to trust it. So Jesus quotes the Old Testament a bunch of times, and so we have reason to trust those books. But that's more of a modern thing. At this time, the Old Testament was sort of already accepted as canon. So among Jews and Christians, and Jesus reaffirms that canon. So there wasn't a question of Old Testament canon at the like the councils and stuff that were happening at the time. It was just, we sort of know that these books are inspired by God. It was the question of which of these New Testament books are also scripture. Because like I said earlier, the Jews were looking for more scripture because they sort of expected more scripture to come at the time of Messiah. And there's some verses to support that. I don't have them on me, but I know that there are. So they were looking for new scripture, and they're like, well, this new scripture is probably found in the Gospels. Very early on, the four Gospels are like the Gospels are pretty much immediately regarded as authoritative. And pretty soon, so are some of the epistles, and I think like Hebrews and Revelation are just some of like the last books to get added to the canon. We've got canon lists very early on of like lists of books that are canon. Yeah.
So basically, by cross-referencing with other books and the authorship, so that was.
Yeah, identifying the authorship was the biggest thing. Was identifying the correct authors. In the Gospels, Jesus breathes on the apostles, and a lot of people in the early church and today take this as sort of Jesus giving his authority to them, and saying, even in Pentecost, like the Holy Spirit is with them for their inspiration. Yeah, and so
I've also heard that some of the like apocryphal books are tonally different in the sense that they're just kind of crazy. Some of them.
yeah, I mean, like I said, the apocryphal gospels, at the resurrection, you've got this big face in the sky, declaring stuff, and a bunch of other crazy things happening.
Yeah.
But also interestingly, when you've got like these Gnostic gospels, they get a lot of things wrong about they get a lot of historical details wrong. So they didn't know this at the time, like when they were picking the canon, but we can look at them now. And so one interesting example is that the names in the gospels, in the actual gospels, they fit with what the actual names looked like at the time. And you know how it'll say like James, the son of Zebedee, or something like that?
Yeah.
That's you would need those distinctions if the book was actually written at the time, because James is a very common name. So you couldn't just say James.
Yeah.
You'd have to distinguish because there would be multiple, because James is a very popular name. Mary was a very popular name. But in the apocryphal gospels, you have like these extra like scripts added to the wrong names. So they'll be added to very uncommon names in Jerusalem at the time, but they'll be added to names that were very common in Egypt around 300 AD. So it sort of gives away when the book was actually written, and other historical details that they get wrong, of course. So
Very interesting.
yeah, it is very interesting. As far as like the Catholic and Orthodox alleging that you need an infallible magisterium to give you the right books, I just don't think that's the case. I think it's totally possible to have a fallible list of infallible books.
Mm.
So this is like the Protestant motto or mantra.
Yeah.
That like
They could have been right, but not.
well, yeah, especially because the canon list changed over time.
Yeah.
So if the church could infallibly create the list, then it feels like they would have
They
it
could've-
right after the
yeah.
books were written. That they would just be granted this knowledge, but it grew over time.
Yeah.
And if you see canon lists over time, they like have different books in them as they progress.
Mhm.
So like if you go to one canon list, it'll like not include Hebrews or something, and then a later one will include Hebrews,
Yeah.
or like it won't include Second Peter or something like that, because the 1, 2, 3 Peter were also in one of the later ones to be accepted into the canon.
So just because they're right doesn't mean they couldn't have not been right.
Yeah. And just because it's fallible doesn't mean we can't trust the canon list.
Right.
There's a lot of things that aren't infallible. We have a lot of judgments that aren't infallible that we still trust. Like, I mean, basic arithmetic, where it's not infallible. Our operations of basic arithmetic, when I do like 7 times 9, and I get my answer, that's not an infallible operation, but I am very, very confident in it.
Yeah.
So just because it's not infallible doesn't mean I can't trust it.
So we have a Q&A question.
We do.
So how does the Bible differ in its historicity to like the Quran or other holy books?
So, other holy books, first of all, other holy
Quran.
books. Yeah, well, I'm going to start with the other holy ones, like the Bhagavad Gita. I think I pronounced that so wrong, probably. That's embarrassing. Is that how you
I
say?
have no
No,
idea.
that didn't sound right either. I know it's Gita. Anyway,
The Hindu one.
the Hindu one. Oh my gosh, we're so bad. Well, a lot of them just don't claim to cover historical events at all. So the Bible, the Bible is a bunch of different genres, right? Because it's not one book; it's 66 books. It's a library. It's not a single continuous novel. And there's a bunch of different genres in the book itself. So there's some letters, there's some apocalyptic literature, poetic. There's lots of poems, and there's also history. So things like First Chronicles, Luke, Acts, these are very much in the historical genre. And from what we understand of literature, these are very much in the historical genre. They're claiming that this stuff actually happened. This is history. You don't get a lot of historical genre writing in some of these other holy books. Very much it's like prescriptive writing, or like this is how you should live your life, or
More like
mythological writing, theological writing, stuff like that. And also, there's just not as much historical evidence for any of these books. So even if, like, the Book of Mormon, for example,
Oh yeah.
there's no existing original copies of the Book of Mormon. We don't find the archaeological evidence of like,
The golden tablets.
well, I was thinking of like the Israelites in North America.
Oh.
There's just nothing.
None.
There's just none of those. There's not here. Well, I guess they're all just thrown into the ocean or something. I don't know. Steel decomposes, I guess. I'm not sure. As for the Quran, it's a doozy. So the Quran is not very historically reliable. A lot of Muslims, especially Muslim scholars, will like to use historical scholarship to critique the Bible and say like, well, the Bible's not accurate. It's been corrupted. But they do not like it when the historical scholars turn to the Quran. Let me tell you, they've got a lot to say about the Quran. Bart Ehrman, I think he said something akin to like, he asked like, why don't you talk about the Quran so much? Like, why don't you critique the Quran so much? And he's like, well, I just don't take it seriously. He's like, are you kidding me? Because the Quran is written by one guy. First of all, it's written by just Muhammad. The original copy of the Quran is just lost. There's
No Dead Sea Scroll equivalent.
yeah. So we do only have like copies. But also the translations of the Quran are like kind of like significantly different. So there's like several different Qurans. And it's not like how we have, several different Bibles in different languages.
Yeah.
Because all the Bibles we have in different languages, they're not translations of each other. They're translations of the original Greek, Hebrew, and Aramaic manuscripts that we have. So the most popular Quran right now was written in like 1910. And it was this guy in Egypt, and he had one copy. There was like 2 copies of the Quran, and they had some pretty significant differences. So he just picked one, and all the rest got thrown into the Nile.
Oh, so you just picked the one you liked better.
Yeah. But the Quran just doesn't have not even a fraction of the historical reliability that the Bible does. And I don't have too much research or sources on hand to support that. I could get it, but
Just trust them.
maybe take this with a grain of salt, and maybe read someone who knows more about it than me, but I wasn't ready for that question. So,
Very interesting.
mhm.
That was the penultimate episode of Faith Isn't Blind.
Oh, fun exercise. Go ahead and look up John 5, verse 4.
Yes.
Go ahead and look up John 5, verse
Very
4.
interesting. Most important verse in the Bible.
Yeah, see if you
Can't miss it.
can't miss it. Yep.
Right
See if you
there.
see anything interesting about
Flame
John
it
5,
clear.
verse 4. Because we didn't talk about scribal issues. So even though I hold a much higher view of inspiration, I think that scribes can still make mistakes when they were copying and copying the Bible. So I think there still can be little discrepancies in there.
Yeah.
And John 5:4 is a very interesting one.
Yes.
So favorite verse in the Bible, John 5:4. All right, well that's it.
That was the
That
Bible.
was it.
And the last episode, we're going to talk about Adventist beliefs.
Yes,
So-
we will.
Stay tuned for that.
Thank you. Bye
Goodbye.
bye.